When do you get from this means something important to someone is yelling at me? Like the actual sense that someone's going, ah, in type as a convention.
Grammar Girl here. I'm Mignon Fogarty, and today I'm here with Glenn Fleishman, technology historian, writer of many articles and books. The most recent are 6 Centuries of Type and Printing and How Comics Are Made, which we're actually going to talk about in the bonus segment. And I have to say, Glenn is actually the second Jeopardy winner to be a guest on the show. The first was John Overholt. So Glenn, welcome to the Grammar Girl podcast.
Thank you. And I'm actually taking John Overholt up on his offer to visit the Houghton Library. So I didn't realize he was a Jeopardy winner. So I will see him in a month, and we'll confab on Jeopardy.
Fabulous. You have that in common too.
That's
he's
amazing.
The curator of the Samuel Johnson collection. Looking for more Jeopardy winners, I guess, to be guests on the show.
Oh, that's hilarious. That's great. How wonderful. Well, thank you for having me on.
You bet. Glenn, I mean, you've written a segment for us before about typography words, and you just have so much more to say that I think it's wonderful to be able to just talk. So you have, in one of your books, you have a chapter about shouty caps and where they came from. Let's start with that story.
Oh, yeah. Well, so I have this, I guess I have a big typographic interest. And when I started digging in about a decade ago, I went back to some of my roots and started to do a lot more research about the history of printing and type. And for some reason, this bubbled to the top that people are always irritated about people writing in all caps. It seems like it used to be something that old people did, where it's always, you can tell if someone's old because they've got the cap locks key on. I think the triggering moment was that one of the telex service for the weather report, it was all uppercase for a very long time, and they suddenly said, hey, it's not going to be all uppercase anymore. We're actually going to do upper and lowercase, because I don't know if the technology had changed or they'd finally updated their software system. I mean, I think they may have been emulating old systems. It was this is 2015, right? Listen up, beginning on May 1st or May 11th, NOAA's National Weather Service for forecast will stop yelling at you. And I think that might have actually been the triggering act for me. And I thought, well, so I just did some cursory searches to say, well, when did this convention start? And all the articles I found, even some that had gone fairly deep, made it seem like a relatively recent phenomenon. They'd only chased it back, 100 years or decades. And I thought, well, it seems to be such an ingrained habit people have, or perception. So here's the question. How do you search for things like all uppercase when you're doing historical research?
Yeah, that sounds like a huge challenge.
So I went to the idea of context. People didn't use the term shouty caps until recently, or shouting caps. And there's certainly an idea historically, back at least centuries, that using all uppercase is a convention for something that's important. And newspapers would often do it because newspapers, until the advent of wood type and some new casting methods in the 1800s, newspapers, you'll notice if you go to Chronicling America at the Library of Congress site, and you can look at historic newspapers back to the origin of them hundreds of years ago. And you'll often notice that the type seems very small, like the type itself for the articles, but the headlines, you're like, well, why aren't they using like banner headlines? And then suddenly there's a point where the type gets very big, and it's a manufacturing problem. Like you can't cast metal type more than a certain size by hand, because you can't fill the cavity of the mold in which the type is being created fast enough for it to form solidly. It sounds like a very mechanical thing. People would snap a type mold in their hand as they poured lead alloy into it, and if it didn't fill all the cavities, you wouldn't get good type. So you were limited in the size. And so in the 1800s, people start developing methods of like cutting out celluloid and pasting it onto wood, creating large sizes of wood types with routers, with new machinery that's available, and also new casting machines that allow them to cast large sizes of type. So you go from all this, what feels like tiny type, which they would often use all capitals of to make seem bigger, to actually large type. And you have the going to war type that's, fills half a page of a newspaper, war, or something like that.
Yeah.
So that's all part of that transition of when did uppercase change its meaning, because it could be used in contrast now that you had different type sizes.
Oh, that's fascinating. And I think that you said that also like doing it in all capitals is cheaper, or at least more efficient.
Well, yeah, I mean, depending on how it was set, because if you're setting an upper and lowercase, traditionally there was literally an uppercase and a lowercase, and typesetters had a case as just a drawer, and they'd pull out a drawer of uppercase in the typeface and put it on a upper portion of a table they sat at, and the lowercase was in the lower portion, and it had all the lowercase letters. What we consider the minuscules are the lowercase, and the majuscules are the uppercase, and so pulling from one typecase could be faster. And so you're doing a headline, you just go tick, 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 all the letters into your hand. I don't have very much metal type around me, but I lift up an example for those watching. But it could be faster. And it was just, there are also, at some point, companies developed headline casting machines. So they could literally, someone could sit there and more easily slide a bunch of molds into a line and create a slug of type that was used for headlines and run it through a machine. So there were efficiencies of it also. But I think there's even that historical aspect, is that what we consider majuscule or capital letters are literally a different type, a different system of writing than lowercase. Mm-hmm. So lowercase comes from Carolingian handwriting, basically, and uppercase comes from Trajan column and Roman inscriptions. And so they merged with the development of printing types in the late 1400s, particularly in Italy. But there's still that difference, right? It's kind of like two different creatures being stuck together. Mm-hmm. And you sometimes see that in some typefaces where it feels like the uppercase maybe doesn't have it's got a family relationship, but the lowercase, maybe they don't always jive together. And so I think that's some of what happens here, is that uppercase has a sense of importance, not because we know its origins, but because of the nature of those letters having a different nature than the lowercase. That might be too pretentious.
So do you think going all the way back to the 1400s, the capital letters carried more significance, more weight, just because they're bigger, or from the perception of where they came from?
I think bigger. I want to say, I mean, that's always that question. As a graphic designer, I think, how much do people actually know the the design principles, and how much do they just think about, what they're seeing? And so I feel like just the mass of weight of the size of it makes it seem like they're more important. And so I could find references, you can find them even back into the 1600s, in which people talk about capitals importing meaning. But the question to me was, all right, from that standpoint, when do you get from this means something important to someone is yelling at me, like the actual sense that someone's going, in type as a convention?
Right. And it predates the internet.
Right. I mean, and so this was my big search was what do I search for to find this? And I spent quite a while, I use newspapers.com, which is a subscription service, but very good. And they have newspapers back for centuries, including UK and US papers, and Chronicling America at the Library of Congress, which has a huge repository. It's very slow to search. And then there's also Hathi Trust, which is a university consortium, or it's a nonprofit that gets books from member libraries all across the United States and I think beyond now. And the Hathi Trust has millions of titles that are searchable. And they have a very good search engine. So I just started searching on yelling, shouting, capitals, uppercase, just any kind of combination of terms. And when I started to get matches on something where I'd say, oh, someone's referring it to it this way, then I would refine that or do more different searches. And the farthest back I went, I was so pleased by this, because before I wrote this article and then put it in the book, I want to say the oldest version someone had put online was 1984. Like, people knew there were earlier versions, but they didn't have a reference. And I found a reference from 1856.
Wow.
And felt pretty good.
Yeah. There's a New Republic article that went back to 1984, no slouch. So what was I'm curious, what was the first hit you got that gave you hope that you were going to be able to find people talking about it in the databases?
Well, I found things later that people would say things like, this is a great one from 1870. Someone said, biggest capital, roared my aunt in the biggest capital letters. Mm-hmm. And I thought, I don't know how I got to roared, but I think I looked for big and capital and yelling and things like that. And I started to find these hits where, people are saying shout and capital letter together. They start using that more consistently. So as you get into the 1900s, you can find more and more references to it. But I think the revelatory thing to me was I was trying to find this is where we get into your subject matter expertise, I think, most closely. Is I was trying to find the point at which it becomes a convention of language or convention of typography that people would talk about. So there's a point at which people assume everyone knows what you mean when you say that you're yelling in capitals.
Mm-hmm.
And before that, I mean, there must be a point in which nobody had that notion. It was just capital letters and it was important. And then at some point, someone can say, here's an 1885 reference, the enthusiasm of the shout in capital letters. And I'm thinking, so by 1885, people could make that metaphor. Maybe people didn't totally understand it, but it seemed pretty clear. So when I got back to, when I got back to 1856, the reference is, this is dialect. It's German dialect. It's supposed to be a Dutchman or a Deutschman, a German man. I tells you, I've got der smallpox. Don't you versteh? Der smallpox. And smallpox is in, actually, hilariously small capitals, but they're actually capital letters. This time he shouted out in capital letters. And so somebody, we have the metaphorical aspect. Someone wouldn't say he shouted out in capital letters unless people understood or could visualize that's what that meant. So I feel like this couldn't be the first association in 1856. There must be an earlier one, because otherwise, if you said that, how would a reader, understand what that meant, even seeing it in uppercase in the type itself?
Right. And it was a joke about box versus pox and his accent. So,
Exactly.
if you want people to get your joke, they have to understand some context.
Yeah, it starts to get a little was it tendential? It's like you're so far away, you're like 2 or 3 layers away already. We've got their dialect and a joke and whatever, and so someone has to get the joke within all of that. And of course, this joke, quote unquote, is retold a lot later too. I found many newspapers that use the same joke about der smallpox instead of the small box. So it became kind of like a running joke about Germans, I guess, German accents.
Oh, and so do you have the first time it was used on the internet to show shouting?
Yeah, that's was trickier, right? We have both. It's funny that it's easier to search, I think, historical newspapers than it is to search the historical internet, and I found with some effort, because Usenet, it's Usenet, but it was a collection of forums of news groups you could be part of, and it used this weird distributed system where there was no central repository, but everything's kind of synced to everything else, and sometimes there were dial-ups, so you would get this sort of propagation of posts in news groups. And at one point, I've forgotten the company that put it together originally, but Google eventually bought this giant assemblage of all the Usenet posts ever, and they kind of integrated it into Google Groups, which still exists. And using that, I was able to find a reference back to March 1984. And the New Republic had cited this, so I don't want to say this is my original research, but I found the original post that they reference, and I was unable to find anything earlier. And he is just this guy named Dave Decott, who was able to get in touch with an interview, which was fun. He said in this post, we should have different kinds of emphasis, and one of them is using capital letters to make words look louder, and using asterisks to put sparklers around emphasized words, and then spacing with the letters, a space between each letter in the word spacing words out, possibly accompanied by 1 or 2. So he was, again, sort of, he said there seemed to be some kind of conventions developing. So once again, he was discussing conventions that were starting to coalesce, but someone else had started to use them, and I was unable to find anything before that. Just the closest thing was 1982. Someone did yell in uppercase, but they didn't discuss the convention. They just used an uppercase thing for emphasis, but I think that might be the first use that's documentable of people doing that.
Wow. So if you want to search Usenet, you have to do it in Google Groups now?
I think that's right. It keeps changing. There was a point in which it was very easy to search the entire corpus, and then it got more and more complicated. But I think you can still use an advanced search and go back and look to the very earliest messages. And so, as somebody who studies language and as somebody who studies technology, you can find amazing stuff in it, because you can kind of go back through time. There is a related article I wrote that I found that I also used the search for, because I wanted to find out the earliest use of what's it called, a dipole, like a greater than sign for quotation, and that was also because how do you search on a greater than sign?
Right.
It's very difficult, but using it, eventually I was able to find people. It's always for typographic conventions. If I feel like I have to find people talking about a convention in order to actually see the convention in use. But by the time people are talking about a convention, that means it's a convention, so it predates it. So that's a funny part. I
Right.
think of like there's an irony there. It's like, well, how, I would have to literally go back and read thousands or tens of thousands of posts, I think, to find certain things, to find that actual origin.
Yeah, even though, I mean, I was thinking people need to keep in mind that back in 1981, 1982, there were far, far fewer people online. So, it was a small number of people creating these conventions and actually writing posts that you can go find and use now.
Yeah, it's true. So somebody could say, hey, what if we all just put an asterisk around words to indicate their importance? And someone would say, okay. I mean, this is like the @ sign arising from in Twitter because I forgot the fellow's name. He just said, what if we use the @ sign? Everyone's like, okay, let's use that to reference people.
Right.
So there are conventions that arise because one person just said, let's do something. But sometimes they coalesce, and I'm fascinated from that, because again, I come at it from this printing and type history thing. So angle, it's what aspects for me of this trade are penetrating into general culture enough that people are using them. And the shouting caps one is not exactly right. It's this weird combination because the typesetters are setting an uppercase according to rules set to them by the writer of an article or an editor or the shop foreman or whatever. So there's this issue of like the typesetter didn't set the convention of people shouting in uppercase, but there is a relationship between someone literally putting uppercase letters in their hand and people perceiving that as yelling.
Mm-hmm. And with the greater than symbol, so that's showing like when you reply, that was put before every line to show that what you were replying to. So kind of a quote. Was the greater than symbol ever used in like physical printing to show quotations like that, or like a quotation, an excerpt?
Well, it's funny. There's a limited number of of symbols that were available in typesetting for a long time because every letter in a font had to be carved by hand on a punch, which is like a hard piece of metal that's then hammered into a pliable something like copper, a substance called a planchet or a matrix, and then you have to pour hot lead or lead alloy into that to make the type. So it's this elaborate, complicated process. It could take weeks or months to create a single size of a single style of a single typeface. And so the number of different symbols was heavily limited. So it's only at a point at which we start to see expanded symbol sets, which is really in the late 1800s. It becomes much easier to make type. There are new techniques developed for carving and casting and so forth. That we start to see these explosion. You start to get sort of specialty math typefaces, which would be used and available. You'll see more and more symbols available, and then you get to machine-based typesetting where someone sits at a keyboard like at a linotype and casts type by typing, and these molds fall down from compartments and line up and are cast as a single slug. So when you get to the point where it's what's called a magazine of matrices, then at that point you can have a bigger selection. So until the late 1800s, it'd be very difficult to use a greater than sign because they simply weren't available in people's in a typesetter's repertoire. It would have been in a specialty math typesetting font, which would have been in a different drawer. I mean, literally in a different drawer that they would have to pull out.
So it was uppercase, lowercase, and math case.
Math case, yeah. I mean, there's this whole funny thing. I've written about it. How typesetters were paid, and because it was a guild and then a union oriented profession. So you can find these books that are basically typesetters are paid this much for this size of type, and type sizes did not have numbers until really the late 1800s. So you'd have things like brevier and diamant and pearl, agate, all these wonderful terms, pica and double pica, and everyone knew what those sizes were roughly, but there wasn't a standardization. And at some point, all the type foundries started to, again, sort of coalesce, say, okay, it's all going to be a point system. The point is this much space, and we're going to stop using these names. But you'll find these books, and it'll be like, if the typesetter is typesetting in what is effectively 4.5 point, where these are slivers of type so small I can barely believe anyone can see the end of it, especially in like kerosene lamps, they get paid extra for that. If it's math type setting, they get paid extra. If it's foreign, non-English type setting, they get paid extra. So we can also track like how expensive something was to typeset that we see, say in a book. We know this cost more because it has specialty characters or typefaces in it. So we know that whoever produced it actually had to pay the typesetter or the printer more to get that.
Yeah. And I have this vague memory of the greater than symbol or something kind of like it being used in French for quotations. Is that?
It's a guillemot. The guillemot is used in some countries. They use that. It's like one or two greater than signs in one direction, and then in the other less than signs, and it's used instead of the quotation mark we're familiar with in English and in much of the rest of Europe. It's a funny convention, but it's also another interesting thing. Very hard to research. This is why I talk to experts, of course, who are you have to talk to people who have spent some chunk of their life reading original work or printed books in certain periods of time, because they know the conventions. And you'll say, hey, do you remember when? And they're like, oh yes, of course, in 1630 that's when the guillemot was introduced and blah blah blah. So when I was trying to find the first use of quotation marks at one point, like when did people start using that as a convention? And I talked to my friend Keith Houston, who he's been
a guest. Yeah, he's been
I
on
was
the
gonna
show.
say he's been on the show.
Author of the book,
which is a great book. I met him because of Shady Characters.
Yeah.
Right. And so for Shady Characters, he had to do a lot of research of the same kind that I'm doing, where you're just poring over manuscripts and books and people's writing and talking to experts and saying, when did the pilcrow, the paragraph mark, first come? So so what do? I call up Keith and say, hey, when was the first quotation mark? And he had tracked it back. He knew, in fact, that it was Samuel Richardson, who I discovered, I think Keith might have mentioned this too, was a printer. So not just a novelist, but a printer. And before Richardson, people used a different method of marking dialogue, or they didn't mark it at all. And then Richardson invented the convention of using quotation marks of the kind of American kind or English kind in the margin to show this passage is quoted, but not embedded in the text. And then not too long after that, we start to see quote marks begin and end pieces of dialogue within a text.
Oh, that's fascinating.
But he kind of, I wouldn't say he invented that wholesale, but he really said, I'm writing a book that's, it wasn't his epistolary novel. He was best known for Pamela, but in a later edition of Pamela, he starts to use, the first one he doesn't do it, and the second one, he starts to use these quotation marks to indicate things within the text to sort of highlight to people what it means. And I have to think, again, as a printer and a writer, I'm wondering if the first edition came out and people complained about being able to follow part of it. And he's like, well, when I set it in type and do another edition, I'm going to fix this problem, and this is my solution.
Yeah. Well, it immediately makes me think of having it in the margins like that. It immediately makes me think of what we were talking about before with email, with the greater than symbol. And just for people, people debate what the first novel was. Novels are not as old as you may think. And some people credit Pamela or Samuel Richardson as having written the first novel. Now, what was actually the first, people debate. But yeah, the idea of quoting someone came up, in the very early days of novels. Before that, I think most things, is it true that most things that were published like that were plays? And so it said who was speaking?
Yeah, I think that's the issue, is dialogue as a convention within writing was, it wasn't, I think you had to have more realistic novels. You had to have the invention of the novel, right, that people are talking. I misspoke, by the way. It's not, I'm saying guillemot. That's actually a kind of bird. It's guillemet.
Oh.
So if people are wondering why birds are in text, it's, or guillemet, I'm maybe pronouncing it wrong. It's Guillemets. And that is apparently a survivor of an ancient version of a greater than sign, which was used in texts even before the kind of modern quotation mark. So printers invented the convention of using like inverted commas to indicate something was quoted, and the French retained, and some other countries retained, this sort of double or single greater than and less than sign convention to indicate quotations.
I wouldn't have thought of this before, but did they use the inverted comma because of the limited number of characters available?
Well, that's the assumption, is that it's the only way that you would have done it, is that because the characters didn't exist, you would just flip them over, and they would appear. Again, I'm sorry, I misspoke. It was actually Samuel Richardson's the one who he started using them embedded in the text. So he didn't invent that. I'm sorry, he did not invent that convention. His first edition of Pamela used that convention that already existed, and then he developed this new one of putting quotation marks within the text. Prior to him, there was some history of using certain kinds of inverted commas and other marks in the margin, but he's the one who then took that, used it, and then converted it. So I'm sorry, he's the modern inventor of the embedded quotation mark, as far as we can tell.
Okay. I love this creativity that, like, well, we need a mark to do something. We'll just take what we have and flip it upside down, and it has a new meaning.
Yeah, well, there's a kind of a rich tradition of in printing. There's a rich, or maybe it's a poor tradition, is that the limitation of what's available affects how things are printed. So, as you know, English had a bunch of letters that fell away in the 13, 14, 1500s. Part of that is probably because the first great English printer, William Caxton, he was working in the Low Countries, which are now, Belgium and the Netherlands, and they didn't have these extra, didn't have the thorn and the yog and all these things. So he came back with type from the Low Countries, and he didn't have all the letters. You needed to set what was English at the time, and that's what was reproduced, that's where the type was coming from. So I think, people have argued different reasons these letters have fallen away. Some of them fell away long before the invention of printing with types, but it's pretty clear William Caxton hastened the end of characters that we don't have them in the case, so we can't set a thorn there. We have to set a th or something. So by the same token, using inverted comma is a great way to invent a quotation mark, and it's only when that becomes a convention, then type foundries start to add quotation marks or guillemets and so forth. And then later, there's a richer set of characters they can draw from for more different purposes.
Oh, I love it. Glenn Fleishman, this has been so fascinating. I can't wait to talk to you about your comics. In the bonus section, we have a whole nother fascinating conversation about how comic books are made. For the Grammar Pelusians, that'll be in your feed. For regular listeners, we might release it later. Sometimes they come out later, but you can go to patreon.com/grammargirl and get it right away. Glenn Fleishman is a technology writer. He's written for the New York Times, Fortune, The Economist. His recent books are 6 Centuries of Type and Printing and How Comics Are Made, and much, much more. Really, you should go to his website and find out everything he does, because it's more than we could possibly talk about here. First, thank you for being here. And
Delighted.
Where can people find you?
I created a hilarious short URL that can be read on podcasts, which is glenn.fun. It's GLENN.FUN, a legitimate domain. It's much easier to find me that way than anything else.
Brilliant. And he is also full of tech tips, I have to tell you. In the run-up, he gave me a great tech tip for the future. So go find him at glenn.fun. That's Glenn with 2 N's.fun. Glenn, thank you so much for being here.
A pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You bet.